Thank you for downloading this podcast from the Forum for Philosophy. Subscribe for weekly discussions of science, culture, politics and the arts from a philosophical perspective. The Forum is a non-profit organisation and our events are free and open to all. You can support our work via our website and Facebook page.
My name's Danielle Sands and I'm a fellow at the Forum. I'm going to be chairing this evening's event in which our three speakers will be discussing being disabled. Let me introduce you to our speakers. Fiona Kumari Campbell is Senior Lecturer in the School of Education and Social Work at the University of Dundee. Professor Hannah Thompson is Professor of French and Critical Disability Studies at Royal Holloway, University of London. And Claire Jones is Lecturer in the History of Medicine at the University of Kent. Hannah, perhaps you can start us off. Okay. When we're talking about disability, what is it that we're talking about?
So disability for me now, currently, is a difference from a normative or a kind of expected body. Previously, and actually still for many people, it tends to be described as a negative difference or a bad difference. I would see it much more as just maybe even a neutral difference, or perhaps even a positive difference from a normative, normalised body.
Yeah, and it's if I could say something about that, I think it's interesting because disabilities never emerged in isolation from other forms of classifying practices. I think it was in the 1970s a sociologist by the name of Mildred Blackster, I think she was a UK sociologist, she talked about that throughout history that when the definitions of who the poor are change, that often that again kind of flows through to definitions of who are beggars or people who are subhuman and the like. I probably would also like to extend it in the sense that at different points in time, and I'm not a historian, folks, but at different points in time, lots of other groups have come under the category of disability. For example, Aristotle described women as mutilated men, and there's actually been there's traces throughout history of women being seen as disabled, that they're all by emotion and not by reason. Even things like premenstrual syndrome, which I've written about, the idea that women shouldn't be in the workplace because we become deranged each month. And of course there's the classic where people of colour have been there's an overlay between racism and ableism here, and I'll talk about ableism later, but that idea that they're blacks in particular are disabled, the idea of kind of being primitive and a throwback. And in fact that's where the whole freak show, there's often an overlay between people of colour and disabled people being exhibited. But for me the linchpin is the idea of being abled. What does that mean?
I think that's right. I think disabled is always seen in conjunction with abled, and you can't look at one without the other. I'm obviously a medical historian, but I'm also a social and cultural historian, and so the thing I would always say is that disability is historically contingent and socially constructed at a particular given point in time, and so before the 19th century, arguably disability didn't mean anything, and it wasn't even a term, it wasn't even a word. It wasn't normative. It was people were seen for specific conditions, if you like, the lame or the crippled, but it wasn't under this catch-all term disability, which doesn't really mean anything. It's just all this label that is applied now for normative purposes. But that normativity comes from state control and the ability to kind of see who is deserving and non-deserving of essentially welfare, and from the medical profession when they are professionalising themselves to see, right, well, what needs to be fixed, what needs to be cured. It's the non-abled. So disabled is a convenient catch-all category for terms of a kind of control, not to be too Foucauldian about it, but that is kind of...
But is that a term that we should get rid of then?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, that's my view. I think one of the things that gives me the shits, and sorry, I'm an Australian folk, so we cut to the chase here, is is the idea, aren't we? We're all disabled. You know, that's often a response. Oh, aren't we all disabled, or we'll become disabled? I mean, I think variability is important. I was just going to say, like, a lot of this stuff is associated with human ranking, and it may not be state, it may be cultural. For example, the caste system that appears in South Asia, which is what I'd also do work in, involves various forms of ranking in which people are at the bottom of the caste system could be considered as disabled. But I think I'm actually very proud to be disabled. I call myself a cripple. I kind of sex it up a bit. But I think the other thing is, in our Western system, and Wendy Brown talks about this, the way that we often have different protected groups, right? Or in America we call them minority groups. In order to access rights or benefits, you have to show you've suffered. That's how often you get protections in law. So I think we need to use... I use disabled strategically. Like, you need to use the label, whether you believe in the label, because often we're asked to tick boxes to describe our situation. That's not a good time to have an argument, particularly if you want to have a service or a benefit or whatever. So you get locked into this where, in some systems, like I saw one with a staff survey once, and they said if you wear hearing aids or glasses, don't tick the disability box, which was really interesting about how you can, in one situation, be seen as disabled and in another not. So yes, it's a lot of it's, as you say, social construction, but also my disability has shaped who I am. So actually, I'm proud to be disabled.
But there's such a kind of assumption in society that disability is something that we would like to get rid of, or we would like to solve, or we would like to cure. That it's really important that those of us who are disabled own that with pride, and kind of try and express through the language that we use that actually there's nothing lesser about my experience of living, or the way that I do things, or my kind of approach to life, just because I happen to function in a non-visual way. So all the medical kind of descriptions of blindness will talk about either partially sighted people or visually impaired people. But I always describe myself as partially blind, because I like the fact that I'm not completely blind. I haven't achieved the ideal of total blindness, but I'm not completely sighted. So I talk about blind people and non-blind people, because it changes the kind of negative positive assumptions that we have around blindness, and it suggests that maybe sightedness is a disability as well, or at least it's a different way of being, which is actually the point of all of this, right? So I think we need to get away from this idea that disability is a problem, a tragedy, something that needs to be fixed, solved, cured. I'm not saying it's not inconvenient. It's irritating to have to do things in a different way, to take longer to do things. It's more expensive, but that's not necessarily to do with these disabilities. That's to do with the way that society is organised.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think we wouldn't say, because there's racism in our community, that you automatically would assume something like blackness is to be eliminated. We deal with the racism.
Right.
And disability does matter. I mean, I became disabled in 1981. I was 18. I was at university. And things have changed now, but it was assumed I would drop out of the university. I had a bed booked in a nursing home, and I worked in what's called a sheltered workshop, so I got paid 50 cents a day to put lids on top of bottles and knives and forks in airline bags. So it does matter. I mean, it took me 10 years to get a degree, and again, the assumption is that people like you shouldn't do these things.
Yeah. So we need to be out there doing these things, because every day we pass people in the street who have a different vision of disability, and who know people who are dealing with newly acquired disabilities and are facing this kind of negativization, I suppose. This is a kind of assumption or lack of positive expectation.
Claire, I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about the medical history of disability. Do you think this medicalisation of disability is something we need to move away from?
Yeah, I think obviously with the medical model and the medical history adopts this medicalisation of disability very strongly, and sees disability as something inherently wrong and something to be fixed. And I think that has to be traced back to the history of medicine as a discipline itself, which comes into the 1950s as its own discipline at Johns Hopkins University, which is the greatest medical school in the world at the time, when there's a post-war positivism about medical achievements and what can be done. So the medical kind of perception of that disability is something to be cured fits in with this medical idealism of the post-Second World War period, and doesn't really disappear until something like thalidomide, and with real critics of medical progress and progressivism by people like Evan Illich and Foucault, who say that if you medicalise things, you turn people into patients or victims that need curing. So the more you medicalise something, the more there is a problem. And arguably you can see that with statistics of things like, asylum admissions. You build, in the 19th century, the asylum movement with hundreds of asylums across the country, and immediately there are a massive spike in the number of people that are categorised as mentally ill. Does that mean there are more mentally ill people in the country, or does that mean that you're categorising people under this new medicalised term? So that is where medical history started, because obviously the people that were doing medical history were medics themselves, who believed very much in this vision, shifted to this very negative view of medicine. And Ivan Illich actually calls the medical profession the disabling profession. It's disabling in the 1970s. And then I think into the 90s and onwards, I think medical history has been very influenced by disability activism and disability studies, where the lived patient experience, or patient is even a medical term itself and shouldn't be
We
used.
are patient, by the way.
Yeah.
Extremely patient.
Patient in that sense, yeah. But the lived experience is taken much more seriously, and that's shifted with the rise of bottom-up approaches and the social history of medicine movement as a whole, alongside disability studies and disability activism. So where we are now, I think we're at an interesting point in medical history where the lived experience of those with disabilities is extremely important, as being recovered from the historical record, when previously it was extremely totally neglected. But at the same time, we need to understand the medicalised history, because that's how we get the stigma that we have.
And it might have changed. Medical history might be shifting, but medicine isn't necessarily.
Yeah.
So there is still practice. The practice of medicine is still about cure and finding solutions to problems that are only seen as problems, because then they could be cured.
Yeah, and it also distorts things.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about, because I do work in Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka has one of the highest suicide rates in the world and has really high levels of mental illness, and I put that in inverted commas. But what's interesting is, you get even culturally different countries having to adopt things like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. You could do a rap song to that, DSM, or the ICD-10, or actually it's ICD-11 now. That's the International Classification for Diseases, folks. And so they're kind of external things coming in. And one of the things around mental health, for example, or mental difference, emotional difference, is that there are different ways of even medically understanding that. Certainly in the Sri Lankan context, for example, mental health or mental illness is seen as a communal expression. It's not individualised, the idea that a whole village or community. And I think what the sad bit is, even currently, getting your point, that medicine needs to talk to anthropology, sociology, to have these kinds of conversations, because I think there are some things that we need relief from and cure. I don't think sometimes people think that when we say that we're opposed to the medical model, we're opposed to treatments.
No.
I think many of us who suffer from pain and whatever, but I think it's that assumption that that certain kinds of human variability should be eliminated. That's where it gets dangerous.
That's absolutely the right way to put it. Yeah.
Hannah, you said that we should think about being disabled as a neutral or even a positive difference. Perhaps you can tell us a bit about this idea of it being a positive difference.
Yeah, so there's a quite an interesting idea that's come out of critical disability studies, which is the idea of disability gain. And you can also talk about deaf gain or blindness gain. And it's this idea that disability actually brings, it's a positive experience in its own right, but it's also actually beneficial to the non-disabled community because it opens non-disabled people up to different ways of doing things. So in the case of blindness gain, we might talk about the audiobook as a really good example. So the talking books were first invented for blind people, by blind people, with blind people, for blind people, after the First World War. And now they've become, in the last 5 years or so, they've become completely mainstream, and non-disabled people are seeing the benefits of not having to engage visually with text. You know, you can listen to them in the car or when you're going to sleep. And I mean, podcast is another example that is a non-visual technology which is suddenly becoming hugely popular. And that suggests that we're not actually as wedded to the visual as we like to think we are, and therefore blindness suddenly doesn't become such a problem, because it's a way blindness is actually evidence that we don't need the visual, we don't need to rely so much on the visual in order to survive or to enjoy life. So I think it's really important to kind of really focus on what disability as an experience, but also as a critical position, can bring to everyone, to the whole community.
Yeah, I would agree. Nancy Mears is a poet in her own right, but towards the years when she was retired, she had MS, multiple sclerosis, and so she wrote some really interesting stuff. And one of her books is called Waist Height in the World, and it's about her use of a wheelchair. And the gain for me is actually there are so many different ways of experiencing human. It's like, and the best way I can explain it for those of you who are not familiar with the disability experience, the best way you can probably capture that is, if you can recall maybe the first time you went to a country or a culture that was different from your own, and just the things you take for granted, totally blows you out of the water. That things are done differently, and certainly for myself, I'm normally a wheelchair user. I mean, how I experience the topography, the geography, how I experience movement, what I see, which, by the way, is people's backsides. So it's an interesting experience that you're seeing. But your height, and we've put, there's been work done on the differences, the height experiences, which gets. So these are other ways of experiencing. It might be the kind of, with some disabilities, like I'm thinking I've got a friend with Tourette's syndrome, that sense of experiencing touch and tactility, picking up on things that you and I might not pick up on in terms of a vibe, gesture, all those things.
What do you think we need to do to kind of shift the general social perspective of disability being a negative thing? Do you think we need to, is it levels at a conceptual, is it changes at a conceptual level, at a linguistic level? How do we make those kind of changes?
Well, I mean, I've got mine. So my work is in the area, I started off in disability studies, and I'm still in disability studies, critical disability studies, but I guess disabled people are one of the most studied groups of people in the world, and there is, I don't want to be flippant about it, but most of the strategies are in a number of countries has been what I call the feel-good strategy. It's just about changing people's attitudes. Now, if it was simple as changing attitudes, we could have some amazing kind of marketing campaign, maybe the people who did the Brexit vote, I don't know, to kind of have some kind of re-education. But actually, I think it's not about disability. For me, it is a deeply conceptual level, and that's what makes it difficult, because it's complex. For me, actually, because we talked about earlier that disability through history's changed that marker, and it moves along, and sometimes people move in and out of categories. For me, actually, instead of studying disability, we should flip it. Now, I'm not saying it's the direct opposite, but I think we should be focusing on the idea, which also has changed through time, of abledness or ablement, because that has changed through time. And we all, from the moment we're born, some of you might have heard about it, those of you who've had kids, the APGAR score. So within 5 minutes of a kid being born, there is a scale that actually ranks them in terms of they're meant to do this and they're meant to do that. So we're actually born into this world that says, have you made the grade? Do you make the grade? So this idea of ableness, and for those of us who, certainly in my case, as you get older, you sort of think the whole idea of ageing, what it means, the pursuit of beauty, what it means to be a productive person, all these kinds of things. So actually for me, because some people benefit from particular conceptualisations of ableness.
But it is also linguistic. I think everything probably needs to happen at the same time. So there'll be two things that would need to happen really quickly, and there's a radical shift in the way we use language. So changing, as I said, trying to revalorize the negative terms, so turn blindness, take all its negative metaphorical connotations away, and use it in a positive way. But also, it's about representation as well, because until there are disabled people, until seeing a disabled person on television is not remarkable, and until a disabled person has a plot line which is not uniquely about their disability, then small work still needs to be done to just make sure that that people are not surprised to see disabled people on television in positions of authority, out and about. Until we don't kind of notice anymore, then we haven't done enough, I don't think.
Yeah, even in the classroom, I ask my students. I teach social work students, and I ask them. I don't know what induced it, but I just kind of said, have any of you been taught by a person with what I call an apparent disability that something you can see? And it was interesting. I think one person said that they but it's like it's having that exposure, so it's not something weird, because that's.
But there's also there's a kind of a fear thing that non-disabled people don't necessarily know what the disability or
what to do.
Yeah. So there's a kind of there's very strong feelings of kind of embarrassment and fear, and also Rosemary Garland Thompson makes a really good point in her book on staring, that we all kind of know that at some point our bodies are going to let us down and we are going to become disabled. If we live long enough, we will become disabled. And it's a terror of kind of that happening, which makes us not want to connect or engage with disability and kind of just keep a bit of a distance. And that's why staring is such a kind of powerful response. You stare at something different, but you don't engage with it. So.
I think it was interesting what you said about representation, and I think that's also true in terms of who are academic historians as well, but also about the subject matter and how histories of disability are written and by who and from what perspective. So it's quite a new field, very recent, couple of decades, and actually my US colleagues, disability history is much kind of newer and less developed, which I find quite interesting, considering the kind of disability activist movement in some aspects of US culture, particularly on university campuses. So representation is, I think, extremely important in terms of how people with disabilities are represented in historical text, who the historians are. Wouldn't it, have a disabled historian on TV would be marvellous. Also representations in museums, rather than stories about this is the great explorer, this is the this is the first, this is and the Royal College of Physicians did that really great exhibition about pulling out works of art of disabled people from the past and displayed that. But again, that's problematic. It's at the Royal College of Physicians. It's medicalised again, and as you say, it becomes about the disability and not about the individuals and their own achievements and their other kind of characteristics, I guess. So,
and you've pointed to a really interesting dilemma, and I don't think actually whatever critical disability studies is, I mean, there's people who work outside of it, but we haven't had the debates that some other marginal communities have had about because you talked about who does the writing.
Yeah, who does the writing.
And it's interesting about there hasn't been the debate about, for example, within many communities, whether it be the queer community or, people of colour communities, about what the idea of voice, who can speak for whom.
Yeah.
And they're feisty debates, folks. I mean, they are really feisty debates, and how people are positioned. And that has some real implications. And, I mean, certainly a couple of us have tried to raise it in disability studies because there are a number of, and I won't mention names, there are some very prominent disability studies scholars who, for want of a better word, haven't been upfront about how they position themselves along that continuum. And it's not, and people get quite defensive. It's kind of like, well, are you saying that only disabled people can write the histories or do the sociology or whatever? And that's not what actually is being said. Certainly from my perspective, that's not what's being said, but it's about the fact of positioning, because we're in this dilemma, because on one hand it's like, well, there's a big push for testimony and people speaking out and doing the academic work, but actually it gets bloody tiring to do all the heavy lifting. And should it be everybody's responsibility? But there are different tiers of that. I don't know what's your view on that.
I think it's an interesting one. I think history is a particularly interesting discipline to consider that from, because there's this I guess facade, for want of a better word, of objectivity around the discipline of history, that we only look at what the sources tell us and we interpret those, and so it doesn't matter on your individual circumstances because you come to the sources with a clean mind and you interpret them objectively without any kind of bias or personal opinion and experience. But of course we know that that's not how history works.
No, because women have been erased from history, and
absolutely,
people of colour and all the losers of history.
So the first lesson 101 of history is about you. History is about me. I write history about me, which also is Foucauldian. I would never say I'm a Foucauldian, but I seem to be drawn on it. But it is. So there is an unrecognised subjectivity in history writing that I think needs to be quite openly acknowledged if we're going to get any further with this kind of tension between who should be the one that writes histories of certain kinds of people. And as you say, it's not exclusively about people with disabilities, it's about race, gender, class, and other factors as well. I don't know what the answer is to that, but certainly,
well, having a conversation like doing tonight's a good.
I think we
have to, because these things also have implications for the job market, like particularly in areas where there are jobs in disability studies or specific stuff around disability. It's really hard for disabled academics to sometimes get access to those. Not that you can assume just because you're disabled you'd be interested in disability, because some people it's the worst thing that they could think of.
Absolutely.
They're far more interested in other things, but
I had something peer-reviewed, it was quite interesting to bring in this kind of little anecdote. I was writing from a medical perspective, so obviously the history of medicine, it comes across from the kind of fixing the patient kind of perspective. And that was taken by a disability scholar as I was valorising that approach. And I tried to say, we have to understand the history. My response was, we have to understand this history of stigmatisation and medicalisation if we're going to move forward. I mean, my perspective on bringing, on my interest in it primarily is my own family background. One side of my family are congenitally deaf, and I felt like, do I need to have that? Do I need to have that personal positioning to say this is my stake in the game, as it were, or is the history enough? I don't know.
Maybe you notice different things, because I was just going to say, you talked about raw texts, and I guess that's scientific stuff, but I mean, you're dealing with documents. I don't know lots about it. Well, I do know. I read a lot of history. Well, I'm not saying I don't know much about history, but it's what you notice, or what.
Yes.
Which bits jump out at you?
And like again, I've got a piece. It's a theology piece, but it's history in the sense it's an old book. Yeah. So it's looking at the person of Moses, who's really important to Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and the fact is Moses has a disability. And I was thinking, along a whole lot of other characteristics, according to the text, the different sources, and a lot of the sources try to explain this away, by the way, to say, an important, powerful man like that couldn't have had disability, God forbid, something like that. But what I was thinking of was, it's what you notice, but also I was thinking about, how do you tell that story? Because that's actually a powerful story, the idea that a disabled person can be a leader. Like, how would that could have potentially, if that story had been told differently, changed 3 religious traditions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
I think it's just as there's multiple lived experiences, there's multiple histories that can be told using the same evidence, using the same sources. And some of my favourite kind of disability historians, if you like, say, the evidence is there if you look for it. It's everywhere. It just hasn't been drawn upon. And you need to notice it. And how do you notice it? And I think having public discussions, more representation, more debates.
But also having the academy take this side of history more seriously as well. It can be very hard if you're working in an area which is not taken seriously by fellow academics, or is marginalised, or is kind of thought of as maybe tokenistic, or whatever it is. So I think it's up to universities to create disability studies programs, and to staff them properly, and to resource them, and to make it, I was filling in a questionnaire online about my research specialisms, and it was using the AHRC kind of categories. I couldn't find disability studies. It's not there. I found gender studies. I found race studies.
Wow.
Disability studies is not listed. I looked under the arts. I looked under literature. I looked under sociology. I looked under politics. I couldn't find it. I suspect if it's there, it's probably under education.
Sometimes it gets put under social care or something
exactly,
like that.
And that's not the kind of disability studies that I do.
Yeah.
It's like an invisible discipline.
Fiona, you mentioned this idea of ableism earlier. Could we talk a little bit about how that manifests?
Well, I think, it's firstly, it is really, really complex. But and I've been working since 2001 on trying to tease this out. Firstly, I don't think the idea of abledness or being abled or ability, because we use that word as well, I don't think it's a fixed constant. That's the first thing. It changes, not just across history but across cultures, but even in the very moment. But it's to do with the kind of practices that we have, and it's to do with ethos, ethics, values, things that are valued, things that are seen, for example, to use the scientific language, which I now do use because this is an important phrase, the idea of what's species typical functioning, which is what the... So I think it's... and it does, and the thing is even this idea. I mean, you get this phrase: see the person, not the disability, or focus on the ability, not the disability. So always this trashing of disability. And actually, I think the problem is we focus on ability too much. This is not to say that we should be kind of encouraging people to reach their potential, but it's, and where the complexities come into it, and it's in medicine, the idea of improvement, the ideas of progress, the species typical functioning that there is a universal human body, and in fact it's a lie, it's a fiction, because and anthropology has helped us with this, because people's physical bodies are the shape of them, the muscle structure, their flexibility, their capacity changes according to how we use them. So if you're somebody, for example, who's used to walking 20 kilometres a day, miles, your body is going to be very, very different if it's a culture that emphasises a different kind of synergy behind hearing what you hear, and even the frequency levels will change. So I think the thing is, I said, ideas of productivity. Speaking of history, the one that I love is a story, and I love it to tell students, because everybody thinks this is really modern stuff, these postmodern people, they go on. And there's a lovely letter, I think the guy, and I'm probably not going to pronounce it correctly, Marcus Sergius. And anyway, the letter is called, basically, it's on applying for a pension. And I think this was like 3 BC. Don't quote the dates, but a long, long time ago. He was a Roman general, right? And what I loved about it was, oh my God, they had pensions back then. You had to kind of come up with an argument to get the pension. But the thing about this geezer, it was really amazing, because he was a fighter, he was a soldier, he was the personification of masculinity. So this is also the other thing about particularities of masculinity. Anyway, in his battles, he lost his arms, he lost his legs, he lost every bit. But the thing is, even back then, they had prosthetics. So he had the kind of artificial arms and artificial legs. So when he goes into this tribunal to apply for a pension, he says, I'm disabled, I can't work. And they basically told him to, as we say in Australia, bugger off. Go away. It was tied to a social role. You've got your artificial arms and legs. You still can fill that role of being a soldier. Therefore, you are able. And it's a really interesting, and that's where history becomes extraordinarily powerful. As you can see, I'm very excited about it, because, but certain people, men. So maleness is often seen as a form of ableism. It's the optimum, the best kind of human being to be in most societies and through most of history is to be male. Whiteness is a form of able-bodiedness. Heterosexuality is a form of able-bodiedness. These are about optimum things, and the more that we slip away from these, we're in really dangerous territory.
Also, disabilities there's a hierarchy, isn't there? There are some disabilities which are seen as less upsetting or less difficult to live with, or less difficult for other people to deal with. So you might be more employable if you've got one disability rather than another, and
Well, we rank them. Do you know the insurance policy manuals? I know it's late at night, so it's always throwing these little humorous things, but this is true stuff. If you have damage to your penis versus damage to your vagina in a insurance manual for court cases, a damaged penis is worth more in terms of a percentage. So the whole human body has been mapped in terms of an assigned value for body parts, and then you get money with it. So yes, you're absolutely right, there's this absolute ranking.
But I think the thing about ableism is it's what you said, it values productive, highly functioning, successful people who can kind of achieve these arbitrary kind of
consistent performance, physical, emotional. This is where people with mental health issues get it in the neck, because instead of this idea of fluctuating emotions, we don't like that. We can't deal with people with fluctuations.
Well, it's very difficult to categorise and put people in boxes if they keep moving, isn't it? So
the point I wanted to make, just to finish, because I've been chatting a bit, is I actually think we need to talk about how ableism actually entitles certain people, and people want to hold on to that. And what would it be for people to recognise that their bodily and mental and emotional state actually gives them advantages? And what would it be to actually let go of that and let some of the others in, most of us actually in the door?
I'm glad you picked up on the kind of Roman early history, because I start modern. I'm kind of 1700s onwards, so that's great. But it's interesting to hear about prosthetic limbs from that time. And
we're still having the same, works and pensions claims where, now it's, what is it? You can only walk 20 metres, you have to walk 20, if you walk 20 metres you can't get access to a benefit. Same deal, just happened back then.
Yeah.
What about the issue of social inclusion? So if disabled people are trying to be included in a world that is inherently ableist, what are the kind of problems that are generated by that?
I'm really mindful I'm chatting a bit here, but I get really cranky because this is about changing attitudes. Do you know what? It's happened to every minority group. We have to fit into the majority, those of us that come from marginal and disadvantaged communities. And it really gives me the shits because actually a lot of the disability policies are based on assimilation. Assimilate. How can you fit in? You hear of people with Down syndrome told to get plastic surgery to not make their ears look different, and people change cosmetically. And in fact, we've talked about there's a whole new field. Actually, you're the medical person. There's been work done on what's called now cosmetic neurology. So you can now take pharmacological drugs to make you cope with stress and think clearly, and all those really nasty, socially undesirable behaviours get repressed, So I think actually social inclusion, I don't know what the UK's history is in this area because I haven't been here that long, but it's used all the time in Australia, and it really still is about assimilation. So we don't actually, it's about correcting disabled people, which is actually what rehabilitation is at. You hear horrible stories. Make sure you wear a prosthetic. Don't let anybody see your arms, bits of arms missing or oozing bits or socially unacceptable behaviour, because it's about teaching us, assimilating, teaching us to be whatever seems to be able-bodied.
And that brings us to that really interesting idea of passing, which is something that disabled people are very have a huge tendency to do, especially people who have maybe like a less visible disability, or who are kind of able to like perform or play the role of an able or a non-disabled person. It's very tempting to kind of even if it means really struggling to do things or putting yourself in dangerous situations, so my white cane is a good example. If I'm wearing sunglasses and I don't have my white cane, you can't tell that I'm partially blind. And sometimes that's really relaxing for me. It's nice because you can kind of you can just have a bit of a break from being always on show and always the subject of everyone's gaze all the time. And I did that a lot when I was younger, because it's just easier. It feels easier. It turns out it's much harder because people, you have to then perform this kind of non-disabled role, which is really exhausting. It's disability is so there's so much about assimilation that people are very taught to perform, to act, look like everybody else, because it'll help you fit in, and then you won't have so many, you won't look different, and people won't treat you differently. But of course, the more people who look the same, the more difference stands out. So it completely, kind of contradicts itself.
It's also about judgment, and I won't mention the names here, but I had a conversation with another academic who suffers from, and that's her language, depression and anxiety, but she looks able-bodied, right? And so she's that passing stuff you were talking about. So, apart from telling a few friends, it wasn't really well known, but recently she's got a dog to help her with anxiety. And she said it, and this is fairly new, but she said the reactions of why do you need this dog? So you actually get this judgment. Surely you're not that bad. Is it just we all need, people laugh, say, we all need a happy dog. This kind of, and what does that do to people? Because I think that's the interesting thing, as you say, people think, the assumption is you're sitting there looking like you're blind.
Right.
Kind of like, well, that must be cruisy,
Well, people kind of think, well, surely, what are you getting out of this? What benefits are you getting? What advantages are you getting that I'm not getting because I don't use a white cane? And, it's an extraordinary
special
kind of,
rights.
Right, well, it's a really extraordinary, extraordinary view that people have. But I think, there's also the practical issues, is that, it's impossible for disabled people to be included in society if society has barriers. So, there's the obvious kind of, stairs, okay, but also things like, reliance on visual information.
Not having sign language
Not having sign language tonight, for example.
So that excludes a whole bunch of people.
There's no audio description tonight either. So where were the pictures? I wouldn't know. I went to a conference 2 weeks ago about disability in football, and it was there were simultaneous translators sitting at the back translating it into 6 different European languages, and there wasn't an audio description track alongside them, which meant that I couldn't access any of the videos that were being shown. And it was a conference about disability. And if those kind of conferences can't even think about basic access issues, then nothing's going to change in the way of social inclusion.
I wanted to pick up on what you were saying about passing, because that's something that's also historically contingent and very interesting. And with in the modern period, when you get the development of whole prosthesis industries and industries for hearing aids and kind of walking sticks and appliances for those with visual disabilities, they become more and more about disguising the disability. The limbs become the colour of flesh. The really interesting hearing devices from the Victorian period are disguised as headpieces for women, and you could have hearing aids on the end of your armchair, and you could have them disguised into fans. So this, the Victorian period is really kind of crucial in the construction of this idea of making your visible disability invisible and passing.
Emotions management. And now it's sexed up, because you can get with cochlear implants, there's a little, I don't know what it's called, like it's a little shield. And I don't know how people do it. Some people see glasses as fashion accessories, so they have like multiple pairs and they match it to their clothing. I don't really understand it, because I can't even afford to have one pair of glasses and revised prescription. But some people do that. It's like a fashion item. So what they've done with the cochlear implants, because they want to market, the companies have been trying to market this to teenagers and people in their 20s, is you can get these different coloured shield things, again, to fashion,
to accessorise.
It's accessorisation.
That's slightly different from making it invisible, though.
I know,
that's
exactly.
Kind of playing with it,
exactly.
Which is nice. Like when you can get like prosthetics which are kind of
artwork,
art, exactly, and are really decorative and are really kind of beautiful. But I think I'm fascinated by this desire to hide, to make your disability invisible. That's
And there's been some historical work done on that with, like, and again, you might have come across this because some of the early advancements in prosthetics, like from the First World War, was all these guys. It was actually linked to masculinity who were severely maimed because of this horrific warfare, coming back to the United States. And it was about passing, but it was also about trying to refashion a different form of masculinity. So here's an interesting, again, a kind of linkage.
And one of the earliest kind of post-war prosthesis companies was established by a former RAF kind of pilot who crashed his plane and lost his leg and became this hero and this symbol of masculinity by founding his own kind of prosthesis company and demonstrating his masculinity in that way, having come from this very kind of privileged, white, middle-class male military Air Force background in the first place. So, that's very interesting to think about where those industries have come from initially and how they fit into the context of the time.
Can I just jump in one more thing about the passing thing? Because one of the interesting things is there's the passing, but we also, out there in the community, and particularly the media, so I don't like me saying out there in the community because it gets a bit vague, but the media, it likes to have this fixed category. Who are the real, genuine disabled? Like there's all these fraudsters, right? And who are the non-disabled? And where you can see this play out, and I've just started looking at this, actually looking at Daily Mail and The Guardian and The Statesman, I think, there's been a huge debate in the last 2 years, and wait for it, is about who can use mobility scooters. And at the moment, the licensing is only for people who are disabled. But one of the problems is lots of people are now using them because they're cheap. You don't need to have a licence, even insurance. And given that we've got austerity has now induced this amazing poverty situation, that masses and masses of people using them. And it's been really interesting because the media has said this is like a war zone. This is the language they're using. But this idea about that these people are scroungers, I only learned that word when I came here, scroungers, lazy, obese, they're normally women, by the way. But this thing about we have to make sure only real... I don't know how they're going to work out who is the real disabled, and to make sure all these other people are banned from using it.
But as you say, it's classist.
Shocking.
And, you know, places in kind of deprived seaside towns, for example.
Yeah. Lined up outside the pub, all these scooters. It was a shock for me. It's like scooter tourism. Yeah, you can see them in Scotland, actually. It's quite common to see the 9 or 10 scooters lined up outside of a public bar.
Why does it matter? Why shouldn't
it? Shouldn't matter.
Yeah.
That's
everyone
the thing.
if it makes your life easier, use a scooter.
Yeah.
You know, why should it's an example of disabled gain, right? It's disability gain. It was scooters were invented for disabled people, but actually lots of people could find
it. Shouldn't matter. And what I was really shocked about, and I'm not suggesting the media represents communities' views out there, but actually, and look, you've got the Daily Mail, which is extremely conservative, and the Guardian's meant to be progressive, so it's quite different, you know. That's debatable, I guess. But the thing is that it's ferocious.
Yeah.
The war imagery is being used. That there'll be havoc on the street. People will be run over by these selfish, obese, lazy, scrounging women.
This has parallels with the language of the New Poor Law in the 1830s about the deserving and undeserving poor and who should benefit from welfare, essentially, and benefit payments. And that is still the kind of language, particularly of the Tory government, not to politicise it too much, but this language of the deserving and undeserving poor, the undeserving disabled. So the class very much comes into the history of it, and I think it's still very relevant today when we're thinking about disabilities.
Shall we take some questions from the audience?
Hello. I just wanted to ask if you could elaborate on the aspect of disability and the barriers in the workplace. So, for example, whether if or when you're going to disclose your disability as in phase of discrimination, which is very difficult to prove, or if you're someone like myself who does pass, who does get the job and asks for certain adjustments and then they're not made, and then you're like, well, what do I do? Should I just pretend and fit in like everybody else in the workplace and then cause yourself harm? So, and then the aspect of trying to support yourself as an independent person, even though you do have a disability, but then having those barriers and then having the stigma of then taking the help that you might need from the government, let's say, because you struggled to get a job in the first place.
That's a really good question. You know, with the OECD, Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, reviewed international policies around access to the labour market, for disabled people. And it was one of those quotes that jumps out of the pages at you. Because you know what it said? It's in most countries, the current policies actually make no difference. So there's something going on in the dynamics. I mean, I think, again, there is this thing about putting the cap out, the Oliver Twist thing of people feeling grateful to get access to reasonable accommodations. I think people don't really understand what that is. I think there are issues around productivity, and I think there's now starting to be work done on this about looking at different ways that people can work, but also there's an assumption that sometimes we know all that sort of stuff in advance. But I think what happens is there's an unnatural attrition happening. What I hear from some of the research forums I've been in is people feel that they start becoming quite depressed. If they weren't depressed beforehand, they will become depressed, is that because it wears people down, this thing of having to constantly negotiate and fight for these exceptions.
I mean, I think the problem is that employers will do the absolute minimum to stay on the right side of the law because their main priority seems to be productivity and money, and so they're very resistant to accommodations because they don't understand that it will actually make you a better worker if you're working in an environment that suits you. I mean, even the language of disclosing that word suggests that disability is kind of like quite an embarrassing secret that you might or might not want to reveal. But that's part of stigmatization of disability, isn't it?
It is, and you know what? The other thing is, it's like also again another telling a story, because actually, particularly as you go further up the system in different jobs. Actually, most employees negotiate accommodations, and boy, to those who are powerful and confident, they negotiate all sorts of accommodations, days off, cars, particular things in their office. Some even get their dry cleaning done, but somehow our kind of accommodation gets marginalised or exceptionalised,
and we get reputations for being difficult and argumentative and complaining. But the other thing is about benefits and claiming money from the government. The system's in place to support people who need it, and disability is very expensive. So I don't think anyone should ever subscribe to the kind of the shame of having to take money from the government, or this kind of narrative of a scrounger. It's completely created by an ableist culture. It's important that we get the support that we need, wherever it comes from.
Yeah, and can I say the ranking? We talked about ranking earlier in hierarchies. It gets into each of us. It gets into our heads. It seeps into us, because the phrase "I shouldn't whinge. There's always someone worse off than me." And my rebuttal of that is to say, but you're the person that's actually experiencing it. You're not those people. And we do it often for ourselves. We think, well, maybe I'm imagining this, or the idea of doubt.
And part of ableism is this strength, this belief that you have to kind of be independent and strong and cope on your own and not ask for help. But actually, it's much stronger to know when you it would be better for you to do something in conjunction with someone else. This idea of kind of codependence on other people. So rather than everyone being isolated and independent, if we lived in a more codependent society where people kind of shared their strengths but also their weaknesses, then you wouldn't feel I need to try, and there wouldn't be this pressure to pass.
And actually, you've raised a really important issue, because, and again, I come from Australia, if you hadn't noticed already, that one of the things that happened, like with Indigenous, so First Nations people, let's come back to your social inclusion issue. There are a number of so-called successful Indigenous people who've been the kind of multicultural First Nations success story. They've got these amazing jobs, and they're having families, and it's all happy smile. Now, what started happening in Australia is a lot of those, and they were really high-profile people, they started actually dying and committing suicide, right? And people thinking, what's going on here? And we've noticed, and the research has been done on that, it's also been happening in so-called disability success stories too. Again, I won't speak for the UK, but in Australia, I know a number of high-profile disabled people, the people who've made it, like really success stories, who have been known to have been publicly either committed suicide or within the grapevine, we know. So there's, but it's this this pressure to kind of say everything's okay, that we fit it in, and we actually can't. Like, even for me in my own job, I have this really severe fatigue. I have to keep masking it. Luckily, being an academic, I can go and work at home some days. I'm just doing it horizontal in my bed, and so it's this kind of thing about universities and employers like the happy success story, but at what cost? And so that's a really important research area. Why are all these successful First Nations people, or in this case disabled people, taking their own lives? I would be very concerned about that.
Really interested in what you were saying about codependency, Hannah, and it made me think about what you were saying earlier about disability giving us access to certain kinds of critical position. Because what you seem to be suggesting is that certainly kind of prevalent philosophical models of the subject and of personhood are flawed in some way, and that actually disability or certain kinds of disabled experience give us access to other ways of thinking about how we exist in relation with other people.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. We do tend to, our Western culture does tend to kind of privilege personhood and this idea of a kind of unified, coherent individual. But I think that's
hyper-autonomous.
Right, autonomy, exactly. Independence, autonomy. These are kind of they come from philosophy, but they're the ideals that the medical establishment and the care system kind of aims for when in rehabilitation, for example. Some of the questions on kind of benefit claim forms. Are you able to independently do this and that? Well, why is that such an important criteria? Why not kind of share? Share experiences and share and become codependent and be codependent. I mean, we're all dependent. Most of us are dependent on our prosthetic phones that are basically our brain that we carry around with us.
Sprung.
It's just a different kind of prosthesis. It's not a person, but it's a codependent kind of.
Could be a person. I think there was a film made about that, wasn't there?
Yeah. So I think moving away from this kind of autonomous, independent, individualistic, because we still live in a very individualistic society. It's very linked to kind of capitalism and success and progress as well, and kind of just exploring ways of doing things that are more kind of mutual and more community based, perhaps.
And arguably that's down to the development of property rights. This is mine, that's yours.
Yeah.
We don't have communal land, we don't share.
Yeah, and that Enlightenment tradition, just to link it back to history and philosophy, this idea of this kind of teleological view of history, that history's moving. We are history's improving, we are progressing. Yeah. This idea of continual improvement, and you hear about this. What is that? I mean, it sounds nice, lifelong learning. I'm committed to lifelong learning, folks, but I'd like to also lifelong napping as well, by the way, too. But it is interesting, isn't it? This kind of thing, this refresh.
Let's make it all better, yeah.
Progress.
Yeah. I mean, life doesn't work like that. We aren't continually progressing. No. History doesn't work like that. That's not what human life is about. Human experience isn't about continual progress, and yet this narrative in history and in everyday life is really strong, I think, and difficult to...
And we internalise it, that's the thing.
Yeah.
Let's take some more questions. I think we'll take there's lots now, so we'll take a couple at once.
Thank you. My name is Maggie Ellis. I coordinate a European group about e-health technology. I'm also an occupational therapist, and I have disabilities that are hidden, so often people don't assume I'm disabled. One of my hidden disabilities is being deaf, with a particular kind of deafness that hearing aids are useless. And so it's particularly difficult in a place like this with a lot of background noise, and you speakers, none of you using lapel microphones. That's custom and practice in the London School of Economics, I have to say. Not good communication. So that's point one. But I wanted to ask each of you two questions which are related to my comments about disability. I've been either on the staff or associated with LSE for 10 years. And this is the first event in the form of a lecture that's mentioned the word disabled. I am fascinated that it's the Forum for Philosophy that organises this event, because having suggested that other departments might arrange something remotely to do with the topic, one has never succeeded. I wanted to ask each of you two questions. I'd love one answer back, one simple sentence back from each of you. And that is, obviously, when you planned this evening, you had a concept of what you wanted to achieve. And the other one I wanted you to take away with you, really, is what do you think you will have learned by this evening?
Thank you. And let's take one more question. Yep.
Hello, I'm Dr. Lee Campbell. I work at University of the Arts London. I was really interested when you were talking about speaking for. this sort of idea around subjectivity. So part of my research is to explore visual impairment and blindness, but I'm coming at that as somebody who I don't classify myself as being visually impaired. And I was recently attacked in a lecture that I was given by somebody who had a disability, who was visually impaired, and shouted out how, excuse my language, effing dare you for trying to understand what blindness might be like. That set quite a heated debate around ethics of representation, sensory censorship. Can we explore beyond our own subjectivity was one of the questions. So I'd just be really interested to hear some of your views. I know you've touched upon that. There was also something else I wanted to mention. There was a really interesting exhibition at the Wellcome Collection about 5 years ago called Superhuman, which was all about prosthetics and making visible the invisible and vice versa. So sort of another...
Thank you.
Okay. Well, we were talking, just in terms of your question, we were talking about this beforehand because I actually found in a lot of mainstream conferences or seminars, actually most, and among so-called progressive disciplines and indeed progressive people, that actually there's nothing on disability, or if there is a small session on disability at a conference, nobody turns up. Or it's the same people, you know what I mean? So I was super excited because actually I found that certainly in the philosophy area, disability in a critical way hasn't been picked up. So so credit to you. I think it's hopefully the people who listen to this podcast will get a shock. Because they hopefully won't just switch it off as soon as they say disability, but that they will be engaged so that in a conversation. So I think the issue about what do you want to achieve, I think it's mainstreaming this as part of different disciplines. Even for us, I haven't met these other two people, or three, I haven't met these people before, and just even us having a conversation for me gives me hope, because it's actually quite depressing. It's really depressing when you feel like you're going in circles. Even my own university, we don't do disability studies, so I don't teach any disability work, and I come to other places to talk about disability and ableism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the point. It's reminding people that disability is an identity in the same way that gender, race, and sexuality are identities, and it permeates every aspect of human existence, and therefore it should be studied in every subject. So my primary specialism is French literature, and I am lucky enough that I can teach critical disability studies as part of my work, as long as I centre it within French literature. But I actually think things are changing. I think academia is becoming slowly more open to critical disability studies, and I think that's the point of philosophy as well. Is that we're talking about critical disability studies. So we're kind of critiquing established models of disability, and we're analysing how it how it can be rethought, repositioned, and how it brings benefits to everyone. And just to answer the other question about visual impairment, personally, I'm very happy for everyone to speak about disability, whether or not they have personal lived experience. I think there's enough kind of literature and sources out there which you can read and which can kind of inform you. I would kind of warn against the slightly outdated practice of simulation, of kind of handing around blindfolds, because it's a very it doesn't. The point about disability as a lived experience is that it's a kind of permanent lived experience,
and there's textures to it,
and
isn't it?
That it changes absolutely, and also everyone experiences their disability differently, especially blindness. Only 2% of people who are registered blind are completely blind. And if you ask any person, I mean, one of the questions I get asked the most is what can you actually see? And I just can't answer that question. It's too complicated. But I can guarantee that it'll be completely different from the answer you'll get from anybody else. So it doesn't. In the end, it doesn't really matter. The kind of exact what people see and don't see doesn't matter. It's the experience of being a partially blind person in a sighted world is the experience to focus on, I would say.
Can I just have a little bit of a different take? And sorry I didn't get to your question on that. I think it's really difficult because the disabled people's voices and the very range of voices has been excluded. So unfortunately what happens in a lot of communities is people end up getting really pissed off. So that's why it gets a really difficult debate. And maybe I think decency in articulating things would help to look at those differences. Where do those differences matter? But also, and again, I don't know the circumstance, so this is not about your situation particularly, but I think, for me, I think people do need to declare about what their investment is in an issue, because we come to different issues for different reasons. And some people I know, I've spoken to people who identify as able-bodied, who do disability research, and sometimes it'll be a really indirect thing. They just fell in love with the issue, or maybe they did have a family member or something else like that. But I actually think that kind of those kind of conversations are important, because we might have different investments, and some of those investments are made to matter. Some of us can't walk away, metaphorically or otherwise, from the issue at the end of the day. It's not something you can turn the light off. And I think because the other thing is about getting back to medicalism is actually lots of people who speak for us or explain for us. And, I had somebody recently the other day who, I'll be circumspect, but basically it was a person who didn't identify as disabled, worked for an equalities organisation, who started lecturing me on what the disability experience was, and how I should respond. And that's where it becomes, we would call that out if somebody was lecturing, a white person was lecturing a person of colour about what being a person of colour, what that involves. I think we would call that out. So it's so normalised, that kind of power issue.
Yeah, I would just add to it. I think that's a good point about the marginalisation gets people angry, and rightly so in a lot of cases. But I don't know what the answer is other than, as you say, just to be quite open and honest about your intentions. And I've certainly experienced some hostility in the deaf community, and I felt like the British deaf community are particularly strong in their own culture, their own language, their own kind of. But as I say, one of the deaf community said, "Well, you're okay because your family are deaf, so come in," sort of thing. And it was really, that was really eye-opening for me. So I don't know what the answer is. I only have that kind of personal experience, but I think, as you say, there is this long history of being not listened to and being spoken for, which might help explain that. And in terms of your question about what do we want to achieve and what have we learned, I think it's easy for historians to kind of sit in dusty archives a lot of the time and think this is really fascinating stuff, but actually getting involved in debates like this brings its relevance to today. And that, I think, you don't want to be anachronistic about the way in which we draw on history to think about the present, but at the same time there's got to be relevance in the historical work that you do, and I think that's extremely important. And the historical context is always important and enlightening on every issue, and this issue in particular, I think. So I'll always be the one that would go, oh, there's a history to that, oh, that's constructed, because that is enlightening on our current situation and also can be useful for seeing where we go from here into the future. So that was what I've got from it, I think.
Okay, let's take a couple more questions then.
This is great.
Two in the front row.
term is hard for our community. Because to white and
the term disability is a reductionist term, okay? Mm-hmm. And using the term disability makes it very difficult for the disability community, given that we are a wide and very, very diverse community.
Thank you. We'll take one more before we answer that.
Hi. I'm a student of political theory, and of course, very recently we've realized that in drawing the boundary of what counts as human, we have excluded a huge chunk of people throughout history. But one of the things that I often think about is it enough to say that we just need to normalize, for example, what we think of disabled right now, and also make our workplaces accessible, make our schools accessible? Or are there certain structures within the society which are inherently inaccessible? For instance, we have a certain grading system which might not be accessible to people with various mental abilities, or we celebrate our festivals in certain ways, we have our transportation system figured out in certain ways. So do you think a more inherent change is needed, or do we just need to make what we have accessible?
Thank you. So one question about disabilities being a reductionist term and how useful is it, and the other about whether we can the issue is just making things more accessible, or whether there needs to be a deeper change.
Okay. I actually don't really care what term people use. I mean, I'm involved as an administrator of a Facebook group, and we use disabled in the title. But some people, depending on where they're on in their journey, refer to themselves as chronically ill. Some people, deaf people, sometimes capital D deaf people, don't see themselves as disabled. Then you've got the neurodiversity. So I don't think I'm not worried about the word.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we all kind of accept that it's not ideal, but we need something. We need a word that we can kind of use as an umbrella, I suppose.
And you can refashion it, you can refashion it. Very quickly, in terms of your question, you do need, you can't, the normalising stuff, that's what I'm saying, the normalising stuff's not enough. That's why we need to focus on the idea of ableness and who benefits and who loses. And that does mean that our structures in place that keep holding that up and helping it replicate itself in different ways.
But realistically, we can't kind of collapse everything and start again. So we have to kind of start with what we've got. But, it's a bit like, I've been thinking a lot about audio description and access to theatre for blind people. And what typically happens at the moment in cinema and theatre is that the play or the film is created, and then the audio description track is added at the end. Okay, but what we really need to do is to create the film or play with the audio description from the beginning, integrated so that it's accessible to everyone. And that could be a model that we could follow throughout whatever we're doing. So rather than, building a building with stairs and then adding a ramp, what about just building the building with the ramp to start with?
I think they call it anticipated diversity.
Right, yeah. So, or, in the curriculum, in the university curriculum, what about designing courses which have which are accessible to all different types of students and all different styles of learning or learning preferences or neurodiversity from the outset, rather than then having to make accommodations and adjustments later on or in the workplace? What about just, making it so that everyone can work in the way that suits them from the beginning, rather than having this kind of normative structure and then some people being obliged to ask for changes? What if we lived in a society where the changes were already there? So it's universal design, really, I suppose.
I think disability absolutely as a term, as a language, is completely reductionist, and it doesn't have, it doesn't convey a complete diversity of experiences or anything. But I would just come back to this point about it emerges from a particular point in history where it is convenient to label lots of people in this way for state welfare, for pensions, for medical treatment, and it's a term of convenience that for the state and for the medical profession that's never gone away. So I think it's useful to keep it, because actually we need to recognise that there is a history to that term, but it's what we do with it and how our language changes as we change in the present that is important.
It also reminds us of the inherent ableism of the world by its very formulation, so that's kind of useful as well.
Yeah.
We've got 5 minutes, so maybe time for 2 very quick questions. So, one here.
Just 3 hands up.
Hi, I had a question about the representation. So I went to school in Spain, and in every classroom there had to be one person that had a disability. And I was wondering what you think about that, and whether and how that compares to having special schools, and whether you think one is better than the other.
Oh, that's such a good question. That's such a good question. I mean, oh, sorry, you're going to have to take another question first.
One at the front.
And then when there was one at the back.
There was one at the back, yeah. Super quick if you can.
I am temporarily disabled at the minute. I'm very privileged to have worked in the arts since I come to London in 1988. And in that time, I've worked in nothing but disability arts. And I suppose this question is heading towards this, you were just saying there about good practice in the theatre and the arts, which I think we are probably leading the world at the minute with the Unlimited Festival and Dada Fest and all the rest. I wondered, are there any other examples of good practice out there, and not just the arts?
Thank you. Should we try and squeeze in that third question? Was at the back? Yep.
Thanks for fitting me in. I was just wondering, today we spoke a lot about what needs to be improved, and I completely agree that a lot needs to be improved. But I'm just wondering, in the field of disability studies, are there any countries or communities or cultures which are generally viewed as quite exemplary or more advanced than others when it comes to inclusivity and disabilities? What can we take as examples? What societies or communities?
Thank you. That maps quite nicely onto the previous question about good practice.
Yeah, and also the question about Spain as well. I mean, in terms of very quickly the debate about integrated education rather than separated education, it's a fact that we could have had a whole session just about that, actually. I love the idea of having disabled children in the classroom with non-disabled children, provided that the teaching methods provide for everyone, so that there's a kind of universal approach to teaching. The problem comes when the disabled children are expected to assimilate, as we were saying, and to keep up with or learn by methods that are not adapted to them. I mean, I would quite interested to hear whether you thought it was a a good system growing up in Spain. But I guess we can talk about that afterwards. I know. Yeah.
Can I jump in about the ideal culture? I think appearances can be deceiving. For example, there's a normalisation, for example, of physical access in the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is used as a template for other countries, and yet we know because of the absolutely outrageous healthcare system that they've got and racism and poverty levels that actually... all this access happening, but it's like a twilight zone because then you've got all these people who are shut out and undignified. So I don't think there's any ideal system. Some countries do it better than others in certain areas.
Claire, you've got the last word.
Oh no.
No pressure.
Yeah, I mean, I think the history of education and mainstreaming and inclusion in that is a very interesting area, and anecdotally hearing about my grandparents who went to deaf school, met at deaf school, and but at the same time were taught to fit in, even though they were segregated. They learnt to speak, holding a balloon to feel the vibrations, and that always really struck me as.
But they had role models, didn't they? Other deaf people. They met other deaf people.
Yeah,
that's a really good point.
So they met each other, but they were taught. To fit in again, by passing as being able to hear, by being able to lip read and to be able to speak, and by feeling the balloon to be able to feel what it was like to speak with their own kind of voice. That is not a great. I guess it's quite an interesting note to end on, but it's not necessarily very profound or groundbreaking.
Peer mentoring is really like, where do disabled people get to meet other disabled people who've lived their lives, who can share the wisdom?
Yeah,
that's a big question.
That's a nice moment to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. Join me in thanking our speakers.